This time, the Jordan River didn't split for Elijah. Instead, the heavens opened up and a chariot of fire separated the earthly from the divine in a storm of glory. And after that, when everything was quiet and everyone was in awe, there was only one thing left on the riverbank: the prophet's mantle. This wasn't just a change of power for Elisha, son of Shaphat. It was a tearing of the veil. He was a witness to what could not be seen, and now he had proof in the form of a heavy, woolen book. His cry was not one of victory, but of fear and recognition. My father, my father. The horsemen and chariots of Israel. He knew that the country's real defense was not in its armies, but in the spirit that had just left. Taking up the mantle was a sign of giving up. It was the answer to a request that seemed bold weeks before on the road to Bethel. Please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me. This was not a request for more fame, but for more strength to bear the divine burden, more compassion, more endurance, and the firstborn's inheritance of a father's heart. He hit the waters of the Jordan not to test them, but to confess, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" The water knew the power that was woven into the fleece and split in a quiet obedience. The crossing was like a baptism into a new life. The group of prophets on the other bank saw not only a successor, but also a ship being built. The mantle had fallen, and the course of a nation had changed. The time of the fiery reformer was over. The time of the kind miracle worker had begun. The world Elisha entered was falling apart at the seams. The kingdom of David and Solomon was a broken memory, with Israel in the north and Judah in the south. This was not just a political split, it was a spiritual split as well. Elisha would walk for 55 years in the northern kingdom, where kings built golden calves in Dan and Bethel, not just as idols, but as political tools to cut the people off from Jerusalem, the temple, and the covenant. The smoke from Baal's altars filled the air. Baal was a fertility god whose worship promised rain and good crops, but only brought moral decay. It was a time of great worry, when the divine seemed far away and human power was both dangerous and weak. The word of the Lord did not come to the palace, but to the field in this spiritual void. Elisha wasn't a priestly son. He was a farmer with calloused hands from the plow. His life was based on the boring realities of soil and season. When Elijah put the mantle on him, it was an extraordinary thing that happened in the ordinary. Plowing with 12 yoke of oxen showed how rich his family was, but he gave it all up in one final act. Burning the plowing tools to cook the meat, a ritual that meant he would never come back. He wasn't running away from poverty. He was running toward wealth. He was trading one kind of stewardship for another. He would no longer grow grain, but faith. His ministry would last for 5.5 decades, which was a sign of God's mercy in and of itself. In a world where coups and counter-coups happened all the time and dynasties rose and fell by the sword, the prophet was a scary and merciful constant. He was the one thing that stayed the same in a universe that was always changing. He was the echo of a promise his country had tried to forget. His very presence proved that Baal was not Lord. So the miracles he would do were never just shows of power. They were theological arguments written in the language of real life. Elisha would clean up poisoned springs and make a widow's oil more plentiful in a land that was seduced by a god of rain. In a culture that values military power above all else, he would blind an army not to destroy it, but to save it. In a world where kings failed, he would be the real provider, feeding hundreds with very little. Every healing and every provision was a way to fix a lie that the whole country believed. The context is what makes the miracles real. They weren't just random acts of kindness. They were planned attacks in a spiritual war. They showed a God who wasn't limited to a temple in a rival kingdom. Instead, he was in the dust and desperation of the north, meeting people where they had been told he had left them. First and foremost, Elisha's compassion was a way of telling the truth. His long, steady walk through the heart of Israel's rebellion was proof of a God who waits, who gives, and who speaks even when the only language people can understand is the grammar of a miracle. The city of Jericho, where the trumpets of Israel destroyed the ancient fortress, was now in a different kind of desolation. The walls had long since fallen down, but a more evil curse lived on in the water that kept it alive. The spring that flowed there was poisonous, making the land unfruitful. It was a place where both the womb of the earth and the wombs of its women were barren. This was not just a disaster for the environment, it was also a crisis for religion. The city of palms was dying of thirst at its roots. This was a clear sign of a kingdom that had turned away from the living spring of God and toward the broken cisterns of Baal. The men who came to Elisha were full of the despair of a community living in the dark. Their plea was a quiet admission that their own efforts had failed. They may not have known it, but by going to the prophet, they were going back to the covenant and looking for a word from the Lord in a place where that word had grown weak. Elisha's answer was a masterclass in how God works, which was very different from what Baal's followers expected. He didn't call for a royal order or a military engineer. He asked for two of the simplest things, a new bowl and some salt. The details were very important and had a lot of symbolic meaning. The bowl had to be new, not used for anything else, and only for this holy work. It was a vessel of grace that had not been tainted by past mistakes and compromises. It talked about a new beginning and a new thing God was going to do, free from the land's history of being dirty. The salt was even stronger. It was the mineral of the covenant, which the law said had to be included in all grain offerings as a sign of God's promise to always be with them and make them clean. It worked as a preservative to stop things from rotting and as a cleaning agent, but in its raw, concentrated form, it was also a destructive force that could salt the earth and stop any growth for generations. Elisha held this contradictory thing in his hands, blessed it in the new bowl, and turned it into a tool for healing. The act hinted at a bigger mystery. God would use the things that could kill, like a cross, and a sacrifice as the ultimate source of life and renewal. The march to the spring wasn't a happy one. It was a serious pilgrimage of hope. Elisha was at the center of the problem, holding the new bowl with its clear contents. The water that bubbled up was a stream of death, which went against what nature was meant to do. His statement was straightforward, combining divine authority with deep compassion. Thus says the Lord, I have healed these waters. From them there shall no longer be death or barrenness. The eye was clear, the Lord was the healer. Elisha was the voice that spoke the silent healing will of God. He was the living prayer, the link between heaven's infinite power and earth's specific need. Then he did the physical sign by pouring out the salt. It wasn't a magical powder that changed the water's chemistry. That little amount in a flowing spring wouldn't have made a difference scientifically. This was a prophetic sign act, a physical story that followed the example of the great prophets who came before him. The salt was the sign of the covenant, the word that could be seen. It was a divine demonstration, a re-sanctification of the land as it dissolved into the water. It was God writing his name on a place that had forgotten it. The healing happened right away and lasted forever, as the Bible says, to this day. The curse was not stopped. It was completely undone, and a higher order broke its power. The effects of this first public miracle went far beyond the immediate, life-giving relief of Jericho's thirst. It set the rules and tone for Elisha's whole 55-year ministry. First, it showed that God's compassion under his prophetic mandate would be very practical and all-encompassing. He was concerned about the physical, social, and economic aspects of life. Bad water meant that crops didn't grow, which meant that people were poor, hungry, and lost children. God wasn't doing a magic trick when he healed the spring at its source. He was bringing back the whole ecosystem of community shalom, which is the peace, wholeness, and well-being that came from being with him. This was a God who cared about the little things that make people suffer. Second, it showed that real prophetic authority worked through symbols that were faithful and obedient. Elisha did not act on his own creative impulses or a need for attention. He did exactly what the divine impulse told him to do, using everyday things that people don't pay attention to, like a bowl and some salt, as pure vessels for divine power. The miracle was just as much in the faithful, seemingly foolish act of obeying as it was in the supernatural result. It was a lesson for the whole country. Healing starts with listening to the prophet's words, no matter how simple or strange they may sound. Finally, and most importantly for the spiritual war going on in Israel, this was a direct challenge to Baal's claim to power that couldn't be ignored. People thought that the Canaanite storm god could bring rain, fertility, and good crops. But here, in the middle of Baal's supposed territory, the God of Israel showed that he was the one true Lord over the most basic element, the water itself. He didn't just send rain from the sky, which could have been seen as a sign of Baal's favor. He went deeper and healed the earth's deep, productive aquifers, which was completely outside of Baal's area of expertise. It was a brilliant move in theology, a quiet, undeniable claim of complete power. The spring in Jericho became a never-ending sermon. Its clear, life-giving flow was a constant, gentle rebuttal to the idol's lies. It was a testimony to a prophet whose first official act was not to bring a sword of judgment, but to bring a cup of healing to a poisoned world. This set a precedent for compassionate power that would define his long and life-changing ministry. The prophet of life had begun his work, and the stage was set. The widow's situation was a crisis for both her faith and society as a whole. Her husband, a devout member of the prophetic guilds who had feared the Lord, was dead, and the debt she inherited could destroy her family. In a time when identity and safety were linked to the home, the creditor's legal claim to her 2 sons as bonded servants meant more than just losing money. It meant the end of her husband's family line and her own descent into vulnerability that could never be fixed. She asked Elisha for more than just charity. She wanted covenant justice. How could a family that was devoted to Yahweh face such destruction under the law that was supposed to protect the weak? Her cry revealed the unspoken tension between God's promises and the difficulties of life on earth. This is a theme that Elisha's ministry would often talk about. Elisha's answer was planned, changing the situation from a helpless plea to a solution that everyone could take part in. He didn't start with a miracle. He started with a question: what do you have in your house? This question was the first step in changing her focus from the overwhelming emptiness of loss to the hidden potential she had. Her response, nothing except a jar of oil, appeared trivial, nearly pitiable considering the debt. But in the economy of grace, even the smallest gift can become a vessel for God's abundance when it is blessed. That little jar of oil, which she probably used to anoint people or cook, was the last trace of her old life, a life of dignity, ritual, and connection to God. It was the one thing the creditor couldn't take, and it was the one thing God would use to get back everything that was lost. What happened next was a carefully planned process that combined real obedience with spiritual meaning. Elisha told her to go, borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels and not too few. This meant that she had to act in faith in front of everyone. In a culture where being poor made people feel ashamed, asking for help made her feel weak. But each empty vessel was a place where God could give. The phrase "not too few" made the point that God's supply is limited by how ready people are. People were judging her faith by how well she could picture abundance in the middle of despair. The next order, "Shut the door behind you and your sons," was a key turning point from public need to private devotion. Behind that closed door, the miracle would happen not as a show, but as a private service. The world, with its threats and judgments, was left out. Only the family and the presence of God were left. This wasn't a secret. It was a holy space where faith could work without being interrupted or doubted. Then came the moment of embodied trust. Pour oil into all these vessels. The miracle didn't depend on Elisha being there in person, but on the widow's active obedience. Nothing in the natural world suggested that her jar held more than one portion when she lifted it. But as she poured, the oil flowed steadily, silently, and in a way that seemed impossible. One vessel was filled, then another, and so on. Her sons, who were probably going from doubt to awe, took out each full jar and put in an empty one. The flow kept going, a quiet but steady stream of grace that filled every container that was ready. The miracle was in the action, her hand tilting the jar, the oil meeting the empty space, and the growing evidence of vessels that were full to the brim. The end was just as important as the beginning. The oil stopped. It didn't run out. It just stopped when there were no more vessels to fill. The problem wasn't that God wasn't generous. It was that they weren't ready. This was a miracle of divine precision, just enough for the need, with no extra. Elisha's last order: go, sell the oil, pay your debt, and you and your sons can live on the rest, turned a holy symbol into real salvation. The oil was their way of paying off the debt and getting the boys back to their mother. But the provision went beyond the immediate crisis. Live on the rest meant that they would continue to get food. God's compassion did not end with freedom. It created a future. This story goes beyond just being a miracle story to give us a theology of holy adequacy. Elisha's God is not a God of excess, but a God of enough. He gives us enough oil to pay off our debts and enough resources to live. The miracle also shows how God and humans can work together. God gives the power, but people must provide the vessel, which is their faith, obedience, and willingness to act even when the command seems crazy. The widow's journey from despair to deliverance shows that God's love often works through the last small thing we have, turning it into the thing that saves us. Her story is still a testament to a God who closes the gap between despair and hope with nothing more and nothing less than a jar of oil, a command to believe, and a door shut against the world's despair. Some people saw the holy in the everyday. In the rich town of Shunem, a woman of high standing saw not a beggar, but a holy man of God in the traveling figure of Elisha. She was not obligated to be kind. She did it because she was spiritually aware. She didn't just offer a meal. She made sure it would last by convincing her husband to build a small room on their roof with a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp. This was not a generous gift, but a covenantal instinct. She saw that the prophet was tired and made room for it by making a safe place for the divine word in the upper room of her house. By doing this, she made an altar of everyday kindness, and the return from heaven would be as deep as it was surprising. Elisha wanted to pay her back because she had been so kind to him for so long. His offer to talk to the king or the army commander was a huge show of worldly power, and it gave her a chance to move up in society. But her answer, "I live among my own people," was a quiet work of art that showed how happy she was. She was sure of who she was and where she belonged. She didn't want any help or political favors. Being kind to her guests was its own reward. This put the prophet in a rare state of holy confusion. How do you reward a soul that doesn't want anything? Gehazi, who was always practical, noticed that the only thing missing from her well-organized life was a son and an old husband. Elisha's blessing was not for something she had asked for, but for the child she had given up on wanting. The announcement, "At this season, about this time next year, you shall embrace a son," was met not with joyful faith, but with a protective, past-hurt skepticism. "No, my lord, O man of God, do not lie to your servant." Her plea was against the cruelty of a raised and then dashed hope. The child came, just like the word said it would, and the house was filled with a joy that went beyond what was normal. He was proof of the God who visits the empty and rewards hidden faithfulness. It could have ended there, with a perfect story of thanks to God. But the story goes deeper and darker into the mystery. Years later, while working in the fields with his father, the boy screams, my head," an unexpected, violent break in the peaceful life. His mother, the one who first believed in him and made room for him, carries him to her and he dies on her lap. The destruction is complete. The son who was promised the blessing in flesh is now dead. But instead of crying, she's very focused and determined. She doesn't cry. She does something. She puts the boy on the prophet's bed, closes the door, and heads to Mount Carmel. When she tells her husband, "Send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys," she is not asking for something. She is saying what she wants. She is going to the source of the blessing to face the person who gave it to her. Her journey is a lesson in how to deal with pain. She pushes the servant to his limits, and her single-minded intensity shows how badly she wants him to do what she wants. Elisha sends Gehazi to ask, "Is it well with you?" when he sees her coming. "Is everything okay with your husband? How is the child doing?" Her answer is a work of art in the field of theology. She brushes past Gehazi and falls at Elisha's feet. saying the words that have been in the hearts of those who are grieving ever since. Did I ask for a son from my Lord? Did I not tell you not to lie to me? This is not an accusation. It is holding God to his own word. She didn't ask for this gift. It was given to her. She says that the giver is responsible for fixing it. What comes next is a tense physical fight with death itself. Elisha's first idea, sending Gehazi ahead with his staff, doesn't work. The prophet's power can't be passed on. It needs him to be fully present in body and spirit. Elisha comes in, closes the door, and makes the room sacred and private again. Then he prays. Then he does a strange private ritual. He lies on top of the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, and hands to hands. It is a deeply personal act, a prophetic laying on of hands that tries to give the cold body the warmth of life from his own body. Life comes back slowly in steps. The boy's body gets warm. He sneezes 7 times, and then he opens his eyes. The resurrection is not something that happens by chance. It is a hard-won victory over time. There is no ecstatic celebration when Elisha gives the living boy to his mother and says, "Pick up your son." She comes, kneels at his feet, bows to the ground, and then leaves with her son. The silence is stronger than any shout of joy. It is the silence of a faith that has gone through the valley of the shadow of death and come out on the other side, not just with its blessing back, but changed. Her story is no longer just about being kind and getting a child in return. It is now about a faith that is forged in the fire of loss, a faith that learns to ask the God who gives life for it and finds that the greatest gift is not the gift itself, but the giver who can bring it back to life even from the jaws of death. God's love for people went beyond the borders of Israel and into the home of a pagan commander. Naaman, a mighty man of valor who worked for the king of Aram, was at the top of the social and political ladder. But he was a leper. A slow decline in his health that no doctor or priest from his culture could stop made his strength, position, and wealth all weak. His story doesn't start with a cry for help. It starts with a quiet domestic testimony from a young Israelite slave girl who was captured in war and is now serving his wife. Her simple, unplanned words, "If only my Lord were with the prophet in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy," became the divine hole in the sealed world of Syrian power. This was Grace's first move. A whisper from the bottom of the social ladder, a word of hope carried by a slave's breath. Then the machinery of human power started to work. The king of Aram sent Naaman to the king of Israel with a letter and a lot of money. This was a diplomatic mission that almost started a war. The king of Israel ripped his clothes in anger because he thought it was just a political trap. He followed the rules of kings, which said that problems and solutions should be sent back and forth through letters, money, and threats. But Elisha, the prophet who lived outside this system, stepped in and asked, "Why did you tear your clothes? Let him come to me now, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." The stage was set for a fight not between countries, but between 2 different worlds, the world of royal honor and the economy of prophetic grace. Naaman came to Elisha's door with all the things that showed he was important: horses, chariots, and silver and gold. He thought that because of his status, he would have a dramatic meeting, a ritual invocation, or a waving of hands. Elisha didn't even say hello to him, though. He sent a messenger with orders that were so boring they were rude. "Go wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored and you will be clean." This was the most important moment. Naaman's pride rose. He had come a long way with a lot of money, and the prophet wouldn't even talk to him. And the prescription, the muddy common Jordan, which is not as good as the clear rivers of Damascus. He got angry and turned away. They were offering to help him heal, but he wouldn't accept it because of his pride. His own ego was the problem, not the disease. Once more, someone from below spoke of salvation. His servants came to him with a logic that cut through his anger. "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? So how much more should you listen when he says, 'Wash and be clean'?" Their words tore down the structure of his resistance. The great thing wasn't a heroic act. It was the simple, obedient act of faith that made him feel small. He had to take off his armor of self-importance and go down into the common waters 7 times, which is the number of covenant completion. Each time he went down, he gave up and died to his reputation. The miracle happened on the 7th immersion. His body was healed like the body of a little child. It wasn't just physical healing. It was a new life. The powerful commander came out of the water with the soft, new skin of a baby, which stood for a new creation and a new identity made not in battle, but in humble submission. When he returned to Elisha, he made a deep confession. "Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel." The man who came looking for a cure left with a promise. He asked for 2 mule loads of dirt, a physical piece of the Holy Land to stand on when he worshipped the Lord, even when he was working in the Syrian court. His theology was still new and tied to where he lived, but his heart had completely changed. He knew that the God of Israel was not just a God of one place, but the ruler of the whole world, and he would never change his mind. But right away, the opposite of this powerful story of transformative grace casts a shadow over it. Gehazi, Elisha's servant who had seen the whole thing happen, only saw a missed chance to make money. He chased Naaman and lied, making up a story about needing money and clothes for himself. His greed went against the very idea behind the miracle, that God's healing is a gift, not something to be bought. Elisha's heartbreaking question when he got back was, "Is it time to get money and clothes?" Showed the spiritual cancer at work. Gehazi and his descendants would always have the leprosy that Naaman had. The story ends with a sad, clear contrast. The Syrian commander is made clean by being humble, while the Israelite servant is made dirty by being greedy. It is a terrible lesson that being close to the sacred does not mean you will change, and that the pride that almost killed a pagan was the same sin that sent a prophet's aid to a living death. The prophets who lived near the Jordan were part of a different kind of community. They were not related by blood or military strength, but by their shared devotion and their shared goal of finding the divine word. Building a bigger meeting place was an act of faith in itself and a practical way to deal with a growing group. The scene was one of harmonious, communal work. The sound of axes cutting wood, the murmur of a shared purpose, and their bodies showing how spiritually united they were. Elisha walked among them, not as a distant overseer, but as a participant. His presence made their everyday work holy. In this place, the sacred and the everyday were completely mixed up. Cutting down trees was just as much an act of worship as saying prayers. It was during this holy work that a loud, sudden cry of distress broke the peace. One of the young prophets swung his borrowed axe with all his might and felt the head fly off the haft. The iron, an important and useful tool, fell into the dark, moving waters of the Jordan with a loud plunk. His first cry was, "Alas, my master," because it was borrowed, carried a weight that was much more than just losing one thing. In an economy where tools were a big investment, this was more than just an annoyance. It could have been a financial disaster. He didn't own the axe head. He was responsible for its loss, which was a debt that could have enslaved him, just like the widow's fear from an earlier chapter. The crisis was small in scale, but it had a huge impact on people's lives, showing how quickly the ordinary can turn to despair. The young man's plea was directed to Elisha, showing that he had a deep faith in the prophet's connection to a power that could help even here. He didn't cry out to the community or complain about how clumsy he was. Instead, he went to the person who represented God's active presence among them. Elisha's answer was quick and to the point. "Where did it fall?" The question was very religious. It made the divine concern more specific. God was not a distant ruler who didn't care about the little problems in life. Instead, he focused on the exact point of loss and the exact coordinates of the problem. The prophet didn't offer sympathy or a solution from his own resources. Instead, he asked for a specific human need that he could use divine power to meet. The man showed Elisha the place, and the prophet did one of his most personal and symbolic miracles. He cut off a stick and threw it into the water right there. There was no big spell or dramatic move. It was a simple act, almost like something you would do at home. A piece of dead wood meeting a sunken piece of iron. But at that moment, the natural order was turned upside down, and the iron did swim. The heavy, dense metal, which is always pulled down by gravity, floated to the surface like a log. The verb swim is intentional and suggests a lively, easy movement that frees the object from the limits of its own nature. It was a quiet but amazing repeal of a physical law, done not to split a sea for a country, but to get back a tool for a worker. The miracle was finished when Elisha said, "Lift it up to you." The divine power had done the impossible by making the iron float, but the human partner had to reach out and take the restored gift. The young man reached out and took it. The iron's weight was now a sign of grace instead of a burden of debt. The restoration was flawless. The tool was given back, the debt was forgiven, and the community's work could go on without any problems. This miracle, maybe more than any other, shows what kind of God Elisha was. It shows that God's love is detailed and cares about the little things that make people anxious. God cares about the borrowed axe, the lost coin, and the little problems that cause too much stress. In his economy, there is no hierarchy of need. The crisis of a common laborer deserves the same level of attention as the healing of a royal leper. The miracle also makes work and living together holy. By getting involved in a work-related accident, God showed that he valued the physical work his servants were doing. He was in charge of their building project. He was worried about the community's shared resources and debts. The floating axe head represents God's promise to take care of the economic and social needs of his people, making sure that their individual problems don't get in the way of their collective efforts. It strengthens the idea that God is not only the God of great historical deliverances, but also the God of the everyday, the God of the lost and found, the one who sees when a borrowed tool sinks and who commands the impossible to restore it. The story whispers a deep assurance in the quiet act of taking an iron axe head from the Jordan's flow. Nothing in the lives of his people is too small for him to notice, and no loss is too small for him to redeem. Famine was a great equalizer in the ancient world. It was a slow, creeping fear that made kings and commoners feel the same basic fear. During this time of dearth in the land, the prophetic community met in Gilgal. Their spiritual activities took place against a backdrop of hunger for everyone. The lack of food was not only a physical fact, it was also a spiritual state, a test of faith in which the promise of divine provision seemed to be at odds with the empty silence of barren fields. Elisha didn't bring quick fixes to this problem. Instead, he taught people how to trust. He told his servant to start boiling a big pot, which was an act of faith before he could see the resources to finish it. Put on the big pot and boil the pottage for the sons of the prophets. This order was the first crack in the wall of scarcity, a promise that life and community would go on even when there wasn't enough. The miracle happened in two parts, each showing a different side of how God provides. The first act was an accident that put people in danger. One of the prophets went out into the fields to gather herbs while the pot was boiling because everyone was hungry. He had good intentions and was involved, but he didn't see things clearly. He came back with a lap full of wild gourds and cut them up without thinking about it. The company didn't realize they had made a mistake until the stew was cooking. The strange bitter plants were poisonous. "Man of God, there is death in the pot," was the cry. This was a crisis born of deep desperation, a metaphor for how our efforts to meet our needs, no matter how well-intentioned, can sometimes make things worse. The community's hope had become poison. Elisha's answer was calm and certain. "Then bring meal." The thing he asked for was the most basic, essential food, finely ground flour. He threw it into the poisoned pot, and with that one simple act, the deadly stew became safe, and there was no harm in the pot. This wasn't a miracle of multiplication. It was a detoxification, a cleansing. It showed a God who not only gives us what we need, but also makes holy and safe what we have done wrong. It was a powerful example of protective compassion, a divine intervention that could turn misguided zeal into nourishing life and stop the effects of misguided zeal. The second act of the miracle dealt directly with the main problem of not having enough. A man came from Baal-Shalisha, and his journey was an act of first fruits faith. Even though there was a famine, he brought his tithe to the man of God. It was 20 loaves of barley bread made from the first harvest and some fresh ears of grain. It was a big sacrifice at a time when he didn't have much, and it showed how much he cared about honoring God. Elisha was given the offering, but it wasn't a personal gift. It was a sacred trust. The prophet's first response was a command that went against the laws of math. Give unto the people, that they may eat. His servant Gehazi, who was more practical, voiced the logical objection that echoed the disciples' doubts centuries later. What? Should I set this before 100 men? The numbers were clear. The resources were laughably inadequate. Elisha's answer cut through the logic of scarcity by saying that God is enough. Thus saith the Lord, they shall eat and shall leave thereof. The prophet's authority did not make the miracle happen. It made the situation right for it to happen. He was the way for God's "Thus saith the Lord" to enter the realm of the impossible. The servant did what he was told and gave the small gift to the 100 hungry men. And as he gave out the gifts, the miracle happened in his hands. The bread didn't just stretch, it grew. The loaves kept coming, and the grain kept flowing until all 100 men were happy. And just as Elisha had said, there were leftovers. This feeding of the 100 is a basic example of how God's economy works. Things can multiply. The mechanics were meant to be simple, like giving out common barley loaves, but the theology was beautiful. The miracle showed that God multiplies things when people give them up. The man from Baal Shalisha gave his first fruits during a time of famine, which was a very brave act of faith. Elisha told people to give out the insufficient, which was a very radical act of obedience. The servant gave out the loaves, which was a very brave thing to do because he believed what the prophet said. At every step, people worked with God's power. The multiplication didn't happen in the storage bin. It happened when they gave away what little they had. Also, the miracle showed that God is the God of more than enough. The people didn't just get enough food to keep them from starving. They ate and were full, and there was more than enough. They left thereof, according to the word of the Lord. This extra was a clear sign of abundance, a physical proof of a generosity that goes beyond what can be measured. When there was a famine, God didn't give out small amounts of food. He threw a feast. This event became a prophetic precursor, a model that would be repeated in bigger acts of giving. It showed that the same creative power that spoke worlds into being could take the smallest act of faithful obedience and turn it into something that could meet the needs of all people. It taught every generation that in God's hands, our not enough is always the raw material for His more than enough. Famine didn't just mean empty stomachs. It also meant a narrowing of vision and a desperation that made the dangerous look appealing. Everyone in the group of prophets around Elisha felt this pressure. Their spiritual journey was shaped by a physical reality that they couldn't ignore. The order to boil the big pot was a brave act of faith, a promise that their community life would go on even when things were hard. But often, danger finds its way in when faith and desperation meet. One of the people from the company went out into the fields because they were all hungry and wanted to help. His eyes, sharpened by need, fell on a bright, strange vine that was full of wild gourds. He quickly gathered them all together, cutting them up and putting them in the communal pot. He thought there was plenty when there was only poison. His answer led to a new, more urgent problem. The mistake was not on purpose, but out of genuine ignorance. The man was not rebelling. He was taking part, but he wasn't doing it with wisdom. This is a common problem for people. Trying to fix things can make them worse in a scary way. The wild gourds, which the scared group later learned were poisonous, turned the pot of food into a death vessel. The cry that went up, "O man of God, there is death in the pot," was more than just a warning about bad food. It was a scream of fear for life. Their own hands had added death to their food. The people who had come together to eat now had to deal with a threat they had unknowingly cooked for themselves. Elisha's reaction to this man-made disaster was typical of him, calm and very meaningful. He didn't yell at the gatherer for making a mistake. He didn't tell the pot to be dumped, which would have wasted the other good ingredients in a panic to clean it. Instead, he gave a simple, almost boring order: bring meal. Meal, which is finely ground flour, was the most basic thing in life and the main ingredient in daily bread. During a famine, it was also a valuable good. Putting this small amount of food into the poison stew was a strong symbolic act. It wasn't a chemical antidote in the modern sense. It was a religious one. The meal showed how God's provision gives life and is the most important thing. As it spread through the poisonous mix, it created a divine reversal, making the corrupt holy. And there was no harm in the pot. The deadly was made safe, not by taking it away, but by changing it. This miracle of detoxification shows a side of God's love that is very protective. The multiplication of the loaves showed that God can give us plenty, and the healing of the stew showed that He can keep us safe. It shows that God cares not only about how much we have, but also about how good and complete it is. He steps in not only when we don't have enough, but also when what we do have is putting us in danger. This is the compassion that protects us from the bad things that happen as a result of our own actions and makes our mistakes in trying to take care of ourselves and our communities seem holy. Elisha's God is a God who can turn our poisons into food. The story then smoothly moves from this act of purification to a second, more well-known miracle of provision, making a powerful diptych of God's care. A man from Baal-Shalisha came with the first fruits of his harvest, 20 loaves of barley and some fresh grain. His trip was a miracle of faith in and of itself. It was a radical act of faith to give the first and best of his small harvest to the man of God during a time of famine. It was a literal application of the principle to seek first the kingdom. He gave up his safety to follow a higher law. When Elisha told his servant to give the offering to the 100 men who had gathered, the servant said what everyone else was thinking: "How can I set this before 100 men?" The numbers were clear. The resources weren't just not enough, they were insulting. Elisha's proclamation, on the other hand, called forth a different reality. "Thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left." The miracle that followed was a graceful multiplication. They did not get smaller as the loaves were passed out. The bread grew as they gave it away, a real flow of abundance from a source that couldn't be seen. The 100 men ate, were full, and, as predicted, there were leftovers. This feeding of the 100 is the most well-known example of the multiplication principle. It shows that God's economy works on the logic of grace, not math. The size of the resource wasn't important. What mattered was the offering's obedience and the authority of the divine word. The man gave his first fruits during a famine, and Elisha told him to give them out in faith. The multiplication happened while they were obeying, not before. The people were not given just enough food. Instead, they were completely satisfied and had extra food left over. This is a strong sign of generosity that goes above and beyond what is needed. The detoxified stew and the multiplied loaves are two miracles that show how God provides for us. God is not only the source of our daily bread, making sure we have enough. He's also the protector of our table, making sure that what we eat is truly good, redeeming our mistakes, and satisfying our deepest hungers with a bounty that leaves us in awe of His all-encompassing care. The figure of Gehazi in the Bible is one of the saddest. He lived in the middle of divine light, but chose to follow the dim candle of his own greed. His story is not one of sudden catastrophic failure, but of a slow, internal corrosion, where privilege curdled into entitlement and proximity to holiness bred not reverence, but a sense of possessiveness. He was Elisha's personal servant, the gatekeeper to the prophet, a witness to miracles, a bearer of the staff, and someone who listened to prayers. He had seen the widow's oil grow and had been the first to speak up about how impractical it was to feed the 100. He was surrounded by faith, but his soul grew thirsty for something else. Not the spirit that gave his master power, but the material wealth that passed by their door. The healing of Naaman was the ultimate test of this hidden trait. This was a moment of pure, unearned grace. Elisha had purposely turned down any form of payment, which established a key theological principle. God's gifts are not for sale. The prophet's refusal was a way to protect the miracle, making sure that it would be remembered not as a deal with a Syrian general, but as a sign of the God of Israel's sovereign mercy. Naaman left with a confession of faith that was worth more than all the silver and gold he had brought. His body was clean and his spirit was changed. But when his caravan disappeared over the horizon, something changed in Gehazi. The story perfectly captures his inner thoughts. "See how my master has spared this Naaman the Syrian by not taking what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him." This solemn oath was used to make a greedy mission seem holy. What came next was a planned act of hypocrisy. Gehazi chased after Naaman's group, and when the general saw him, he got out of his chariot to show respect. Gehazi then told a lie. He made up a crisis by saying that prophets from the hills of Ephraim had come to visit all of a sudden. He then made up a need for a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothes. The request was clear, showing that the person had already figured out how much the thing they had been denied was worth. He used the holiness of the prophetic community as an excuse to get what he wanted. Naaman, who was eager to show his thanks and was now living in the new economy of grace, urged him to take even more. Gehazi took the things, put them safely in his house, and then went to see Elisha, his spiritual father, as if nothing had happened. The corruption was now complete, going from private thoughts to secret actions to open cover-ups. Elisha's confrontation was not based on rumors, but on what God told him. "Where have you been, Gehazi?" he asked, and it broke his heart. "Your servant went nowhere," was a quick lie. At that moment, the gap between prophet and servant was fully shown. Elisha, who was spiritually in tune with the movements of God's chariots, also knew how greedy his servant was. He asked, "Did my heart not go with you when the man turned from his chariot to meet you?" The prophet had seen the whole ugly thing as a spiritual witness. His later rhetorical questions made the deep offense clear. "Is it a time to receive money and to receive garments, oliveyards and vineyards, sheep and oxen, men servants and maidservants?" He compared the ordinary, temporary wealth that Gehazi had taken to the sacred, eternal work that had just been done, healing a man and saving a soul. The result was quick and made sense in a symbolic way. "Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever." The disease that had been cleansed from the repentant pagan by grace was now transferred to the covetous Israelite as a consequence. Naaman's leprosy had helped him become more humble and have faith. Gehazi's leprosy would be a sign of his spiritual failure. He left Elisha's house, a leper, white as snow. The change in his body was like the change in his mind. His greed had become a visible, isolating condition. The man who wanted to make his family richer instead cursed it, making sure that people would remember his name, not for service, but for scandal. Gehazi's story is the best example of how dangerous it is to be too familiar with spiritual things. He wasn't an outsider. He was the insider who took care of the holy things but wanted the world's trinkets. His story shows that you can hold the prophet's staff, see the axe head floating, and still have a heart that hasn't been changed by the power it gives. He is the eternal warning that the biggest danger to a life of faith may not be persecution from the outside, but the slow, internal corruption of a heart that learns to trade in the currency of heaven while secretly hoarding the treasures of earth. In his white as snow leprosy, we see the sad end of being close to God without changing. A soul that stood in the river of God's power but died of thirst that he caused himself. The king of Syria was so angry that he wanted to get back at the person who had hurt him. But no matter how carefully he planned his military strategies, they were always guessed and stopped. It was only natural for him to think that there was a mole in his ranks, but the truth was much worse. His opponent was not a human spy, but a prophet whose ears were attuned to God's very words. His servants told him, "Elisha, the prophet in Israel, tells the king of Israel what you say in your bedroom." This new information completely changed the way people thought about the conflict. It was no longer a fight between kings. It was a fight between earthly power and divine intelligence. The Syrian king sent a huge army, including horses and chariots, not to fight Israel's troops in the open, but to surround the small city of Dothan and capture a single unarmed man. The picture showed a lot of focused power, like a sledgehammer aimed at a sparrow. The morning in Dothan brought a scary sight. The hills around the city were full of the shine of Syrian steel. Elisha's servant woke up early and saw this scene of certain death. He yelled to his boss, "Oh, my master, what should we do?" Was the voice of pure, unmitigated human terror. He only saw the geometry of siege and capture, which is the only way a military equation can end. Elisha's answer was one of the most powerful statements of faith in the Bible. It was a way of putting things in perspective. Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. To the servant's eyes, this was an absurdity, a denial of what he could see. They could see the Syrian army which was all around them. Who were those who are with us? Elisha's next prayer wasn't for help, but for understanding. Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. The miracle that happened next wasn't an outside rescue, but an inside opening. The Lord opened the young man's eyes, and the landscape of Dothan changed. The mountains were no longer just hills of rock and scrub. They were now covered with a heavenly army. Behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. The more that Elisha had talked about was now clear. A divine army, blazing and invincible, ready to protect, but not attack. The servant's point of view changed forever. The Syrian army wasn't the real threat. The real power was the silent, waiting host of heaven. It wasn't really Israel and Aram that were fighting. It was the kingdom of God against the powers of the world. Elisha then performed a second, more confusing miracle with this heavenly assurance behind him. As the Syrian army came to the city to get him, Elisha prayed to the Lord, "Strike this people, I pray, with blindness." The blindness that fell on them was not a physical destruction of their optic nerves, but a divine sending of confusion of perception. They could see, but they couldn't tell what it was or understand it. Their mission was unclear, and their reality was distorted. Elisha walked up to them with confidence and said, "This is not the way, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I'll take you to the man you want to see." They quickly agreed. The prophet they were supposed to catch now led them. The hunter's intended prey led them straight to the center of their enemy's capital. The scene in Samaria was the height of dramatic irony. The Syrian army was stuck inside the city walls, unable to see or find their way. The king of Israel saw this as a great chance for his army. He asked Elisha, "My father, should I hit them?" With great interest. "Should I hit them?" was the voice of reason in politics and the military. It was the expected worldly end to this strange turn of events. But Elisha's answer brought in a higher law, the law of compassionate victory. "You will not hit them. Would you kill those you have captured with your sword and bow?" Instead, he ordered a gesture of stunning grace. "Set food and water before them so they can eat and drink and go to their master." The feast that was set up for the enemy army in the middle of Samaria was a different kind of miracle. It was a miracle of the heart, a sign from God that the cycle of violence should stop. The Syrian soldiers' blindness went away as they ate and drank. They saw that they were in the capital of their enemy. But they weren't chained up prisoners. They were guests at a table. The act of being kind had taken away their weapons more than any sword could. They went back to their master with full stomachs and a new understanding of the God of Israel. The last line of the text is a simple but strong one. "And the bands of Syria came no more into the land of Israel." The threat to the military was not stopped by greater force, but by greater grace. The story of the army that was blinded is really about seeing. It shows that the biggest threat is not what we can see, but how blind we are to the truth about reality. In this reality, fiery chariots outnumber earthly armies, and a prophet's compassion is stronger than a king's sword. The siege of Samaria was the worst suffering that people could ever go through. It was a time when civilization's last fragile threads came undone. The Syrian army had surrounded the city and locked its gates. After the birds disappeared and all the green things began to die, the ground seemed to groan under the weight of the silence. That great and terrible teacher, famine, began its slow, methodical work. It first taught people how to save money, then how to be desperate, and finally, a sick new way of thinking. The worst part of the horror happened when the king of Israel talked to two women who told him about a case of cannibalism, a broken promise between mothers in which a son had been eaten. The king ripped his clothes, and the people could see that he was wearing sackcloth under his royal robes. But this act of mourning was useless. His anger at Elisha was the kind of anger a man feels when he is stuck with a problem that no royal order can fix. This trouble is from God. Why should I keep waiting for the Lord? In his despair, he didn't see the prophet as an intercessor, but as a sign of a God who had failed to act. But at the same time that the king decided to kill Elisha, the prophet was saying something that went against all evidence. He sat in his house and told the city's elders a prophecy that must have sounded crazy or mean. Hear the word of the Lord. The Lord says, "Tomorrow at this time, a seah of fine flour will be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." The king's captain, who was a cynical realist, laughed at how impossible this was. Could this happen if the Lord himself made windows in heaven? Elisha's answer was a chilling judgment on faithless sight. You will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat it. The way this impossible rescue worked didn't start in the heavens. It started with the most marginalized people on earth. 4 lepers sat at the city gate, stuck between a death inside the walls and a death outside. Their reasoning was a stark, beautiful logic of despair. Why are we sitting here until we die? If we say we will go into the city, the famine is in the city and we will die there. And if we stay here, we'll die too. So now let's give up and join the Syrian army. We will live if they let us live, and we will die if they kill us. Because they were outcasts, they were free from the paralysis of hope that gripped those inside. They had nothing to lose, which made them the perfect people to make a shocking discovery. They got up at dusk and stumbled toward the Syrian camp, ready for a sword blow or a spear point. But when they got to the camp, it was completely empty and quiet. There was no one there. The Lord had done a second miracle of perception, like the blinding at Dothan, but this time he made the Syrians hear what wasn't there. He had made them hear the noise of chariots and the noise of horses, the noise of a great army. The whole Syrian army had fled in a panic, leaving behind their tents, horses, donkeys, and the whole camp intact. They thought that the kings of the Hittites and Egyptians had hired them to fight against them. The lepers, who were starving and outcasts, walked into a scene of impossible wealth. They ate and drank, took silver, gold, and clothes, and then hid them. But then, in the middle of their private feast, they had a moment of conscience and said, "We are not doing the right thing. We are quiet on this day of good news. We will be punished if we wait until morning light. Now let's go and tell the king's family." The gatekeeper's report set off a chain of events that went from doubt to ecstatic confirmation. The king sent scouts to follow the littered path of old clothes and equipment all the way to the Jordan, where they confirmed the flight. Then the city that was starving exploded. The people ran out and stole from the Syrian camp. The word of the Lord, spoken through Elisha, came true exactly as it was written. Fine flour and barley were sold for almost nothing at the gate of Samaria. In the chaos that followed, the king put the same cynical captain in charge of the gate, and the people, in their desperate rush to life, trampled him to death. He saw the plenty with his own eyes, but he didn't eat any, just like Elisha had told him to. The siege of Samaria is the best proof that God provides for people even when things seem hopeless. It shows that he often saves people through the most unlikely means, not through the king or the army, but through outcasts who had given up all hope. It shows that the breakthrough often needs a leap of faith, which means moving toward the thing we are most afraid of. And it proves that the word of the Lord has the power to make its own reality, turning the darkest hour of despair into the dawn of a day of unimaginable abundance. This fulfills the promise that there is a table prepared even in the valley of the shadow of death. The prophet who had once seen his master rise in a storm of fire was now stuck in bed with an illness. Elisha, the man whose words had made water clean, oil plentiful, and brought the dead back to life, was now trapped by the last and most universal human condition: death. He was sick with the illness of which he would die. A serious reminder that God's power is still in a body that is made of clay and will eventually decay like the people he served. Even though he was getting weaker physically, his prophetic authority didn't change. This made the worried King Joash of Israel come down from his throne to the prophet's humble bedside. The king's visit was more than just a polite gesture. It showed that the country's real defense wasn't its armies, but the spirit of this dying man. The king cried out, "My father! My father!" just like Elisha did decades before when Elijah left. The horsemen and chariots of Israel. The title was a deep recognition. The dying prophet on the bed was a better defense for the country than all of its military bases. In this holy, in-between place between life and death, Elisha's last acts were not of passive acceptance, but of active commissioning. He told the king to get a bow and arrows. The bow was a weapon of war, and the arrows were weapons of judgment and deliverance. This was not just a symbolic act, it was a way for God's power to flow. "Get a bow and arrows," Elisha told the king, and he did. Then came the powerful personal moment of transfer. "Put your hand on the bow," Elisha said. When the king did this, Elisha put his hands over the king's hands. It was a layered picture. The dying prophet's hands, which had lifted the widow's jar and raised the Shunammite's son, were now covering the king's hands, which held the country's political and military power. That touch brought the spiritual authority of the prophet and the secular power of the monarchy together and gave them more power. Elisha told the king to open the eastern window with their hands on the bow. This was not a random way to go. Their longtime enemy, Aram, was in the east, where threats and invasions came all the time. The open window showed the thing that made the country so anxious. "Go ahead," Elisha ordered. As the arrow flew eastward from their joined hands, the prophet said, "The arrow of the Lord's deliverance, and the arrow of deliverance from Syria. For you must strike the Syrians in Aphek until you have consumed them." The shot was more than just a physical act. It was a prophetic decree. The arrow's flight was a sign of God's promised victory, a divine yes spoken into the nation's fear. The prophecy and the victory, on the other hand, depended on the king's faith and determination. Then Elisha told the king to do something else that was even more confusing. "Take the arrows," he said, and the king did. "Hit the ground," the prophet said. The king hit the ground 3 times with the arrows and then stopped. It was a careful, maybe even hesitant answer. The prophet was very angry with him. Elisha said, "You should have hit 5 or 6 times. Then you would have hit Syria until it was gone. But now you will only hit Syria 3 times. The king's limited action showed that he didn't have much faith. He had followed the letter of the law, but he didn't have the strong, full commitment that true faith requires. He saw the ritual, but he didn't understand the idea behind it, which was to have strong, constant faith. His lack of enthusiasm would make his victory less impressive. Elisha passed away and was laid to rest. The man through whom God's power had flowed so strongly was returned to the dust. But the story of his prophetic power wasn't over yet. In the spring of the next year, groups of Moabite raiders came into the country. While some Israelites were burying a man, they saw one of these raiding groups and in a panic, quickly threw the dead man into the nearest tomb, which happened to be Elisha's. As soon as the dead man's body touched Elisha's bones, he revived and stood on his feet. This miracle after death was the best proof that the power that had been on Elisha would last forever. It was a power that even death could not stop. The prophetic anointing was so strong that it stayed in the physical remains of his body and could give life. Even after the prophet's spirit had left, Elisha's deathbed prophecy and its subsequent fulfillment exemplify a profound theology of enduring authority. They say that the word of the Lord, once spoken in faith, lasts longer than the prophet who says it. They show that God's power doesn't end when people die. It can keep working through the legacy of a faithful life. And they show us the serious truth that how we respond to God's promises can affect how they come true. We need to be willing to strike the ground with the unwavering faith that accepts everything God has said. Elisha was the chariots and horsemen of Israel in life and in death. This shows that God's power is not in human strength, but in faithful surrender, and that once His word is spoken, it will accomplish its purpose across the boundaries of life and death. It seemed that death had ended Elisha's story. The great prophet was buried, and his voice and miraculous hands were still. The man who had been a channel for the divine was now back to the elements. For a while, the land only remembered how powerful he was. Then the Moabite raiders came, sweeping across the countryside in their seasonal pattern of violence. This was a stark reminder that the world's chaos goes on, even when its saints die. In this scary but normal setting, a group of Israelites had the serious job of burying someone. While they were taking a dead man to his grave, they saw one of these raiding groups. Ritual decorum was put aside in favor of panic, that sharp and immediate instinct to stay alive. They had to get rid of the body and run away. Elisha's tomb was the closest one that was open. They were in such a hurry that they opened the tomb and threw the dead man inside without any ceremony. His body fell down and landed on the bones of the prophet. What happened in that dark, quiet place is a mystery that goes against all natural and religious expectations. When the dead man's body touched Elisha's bones, he revived and stood on his feet. There was no flash of light, no sound of a divine command, and no dramatic gesture. The miracle happened in the deepest silence, when death unintentionally touched something holy. Elisha didn't want or do this miracle. It was a miracle that his holy life was. The power that had flowed through him in life had so filled him that it stayed with him even after he died. His body was a lasting proof of a holiness that death could not take away. The bones weren't magical artifacts, but they were holy because they were the earthly home of a spirit that had completely given itself to God. When they came into contact with death, they became a channel for life once more. This miracle that happened after the person's death is a one-of-a-kind event in the Bible. It makes a strong theological point about what real power is. Elisha never claimed that his authority was his own during his ministry. It was always the power of the God he served that flowed through him like a vessel. The floating axe head, the multiplied oil, and the boy from Shunammite who came back to life were all done by a powerful God through a willing servant. The resurrection in the tomb is the most clear example of this idea. It shows that the power was always God's, so closely tied to Elisha's life of submission that it could work even when he wasn't consciously praying or believing. The vessel was broken, but the anointing that had soaked into it was still strong. The miracle also shows how important the physical world is in God's economy. The Bible always says no to a faith that is purely spiritual and looks down on the material world. God made the world and said it was good. He often uses physical things to show us spiritual truths. The physical waters of the Jordan healed Naaman. The physical touch of Elisha's body brought the Shunammite's son back to life, and the physical meal cleansed the poisoned stew. The revival from Elisha's bones is the most important part of this theme. It shows that a life lived in faithful obedience to God can make a person's body holy, so that their body itself becomes a testament to the God who lives in and honors the dust from which we are made. It is a strong affirmation that holiness is not just an idea, but a quality that can affect our physical lives. Also, this event connects the Old and New Testaments and hints at a greater resurrection power that is to come. It is unique, but it foreshadows a time when the power of life over death will be clearly and universally shown. In the book of Acts, we read about people carrying handkerchiefs and aprons that had touched the Apostle Paul to sick people, and the sick people getting better. This shadow of Peter healing the sick is part of the same theological truth. God is so powerful that he can work through the physical connections of his holy servants. Elisha's bones point to the ultimate source of this power, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. His body, which was crucified and then resurrected, has the ultimate power over death, not just for a moment in a tomb, but for all eternity for those who are united to him by faith. The man who came out of Elisha's tomb was a living sermon. His very existence proclaimed that the God of Elisha was the God of life, that the prophet's ministry was authored by a power that death could not terminate, and that a life fully surrendered to God leaves a legacy that continues to breathe life into a dead and desperate world long after the individual has departed. The quiet, unexpected revival that happened in a prophet's tomb is the last and most convincing proof of Elisha's ministry. His God was and is the God of the living, and even the dust of his faithful servants can become a fountain of life in his presence. If you think of Elisha's miracles as just a list of strange things that happened, you are missing the most important part of them. They were not random shows of power meant to shock people. They were a complex way for God to talk to people. Each miracle was like a theological sentence, a real word that God spoke into the specific situation of a nation that was having trouble finding its spiritual identity. In a land that worshipped Baal, a god of predictable cycles and local fertility, the miracles of Elisha showed that Yahweh was the supreme Lord over all areas and that his provision came from his loving nature, not from seasonal patterns. The miracles were a kind of divine rhetoric, not made up of syllogisms but of salt bowls, floating iron, and sons who came back to life. Each one broke down a lie about God and built up the truth about who he is. We can see that this divine language has several different types. The first miracles of provision went right against the main story of Baal worship. The healing of Jericho's waters, the multiplication of the widow's oil, and the feeding of the 100 men were not just about meeting needs. They were statements that Yahweh, not Baal, was in charge of the most important parts of life: water, economic stability, and bread. He didn't give through the impersonal forces of nature. Instead, he did it through personal, targeted acts of kindness. The second type of miracle was the ability to control nature, like the floating axe head and the Syrian army being struck blind. These acts showed that the God of Israel was not a territorial deity limited to sanctuaries, but the master of physics and perception, whose power could make iron swim and confuse the senses of an entire army to protect his people. Healing and resurrection miracles, such as Naaman's cleansing, the raising of the Shunammite's son, and the revival after death, make up a third category. These actions showed that God cares about each person's body and soul, has the power to fix the worst kinds of corruption, and has the final say over life and death. They showed a God who is close to people who are suffering, whether it's the physical decay of leprosy or the emotional pain of a mother. Lastly, the miracles had a clear teaching purpose, showing people important spiritual truths. The widow's collection of jars showed how to make room for God's blessings. Naaman's immersion in the Jordan demonstrated that salvation frequently arises from humble, seemingly irrational obedience. King Joash's limited victory showed that the fulfillment of God's promise is often in line with how strong our faith is. The consistent motive of compassion is what drives this whole framework. Elisha's ministry is very different from Elijah's, which was more confrontational and called for fire. Elijah's miracles often showed judgment, like the drought and the fire on Carmel. But Elisha's miracles mostly showed mercy. God's compassionate heart, not the prophet's fame, is what drives the healing of a city's water supply and the feeding of a starving army. Elisha expresses the sovereignty of God, a central theme in Elijah's contest on Carmel, in a tender way. God is sovereign so that he can be kind. He uses his power over nature, armies, and even death to bring communities back together, save people, and protect the weak. This theological framework changes the way we read Elisha's story from a series of amazing events to a clear picture of God's character. The miracles aren't the point. They're the grammar and syntax of a love letter to people who have gone astray. They describe a God who is both powerful and caring, who controls the forces of nature, but also cares for a lost axe head. They show that divine power is never used randomly, but is always channeled through the two channels of sovereignty and mercy. To comprehend Elisha's miracles is to recognize that God is not mute. He talks, and his words include things like water, oil, bread, and bones that people use every day. In the divine economy, every act of power is a form of communication, and every miracle is a word of grace spoken in the language of human need. If miracles are a divine language, then the human heart is the ground where these seeds grow. The narratives of Elisha illustrate that the reception of a miracle is seldom a passive occurrence. It constitutes a dynamic interaction influenced by the complex psychology of the recipient. Throughout the narratives, a range of postures is revealed, demonstrating how internal landscapes of faith, pride, desperation, and hope can either facilitate or inadvertently obstruct divine intervention. The miracle is available, but its actualization frequently depends on the intricate and often chaotic human reaction to the prophet's perplexing message. The paradigm of resistant pride is most clearly shown in Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army. His hopes were carefully built around his social status and the rules of his culture. He thought he would have a big ceremonial healing that was appropriate for his rank, with a private meeting with the prophet, dramatic gestures, and spells. Instead, he got a short, impersonal message from a servant telling him to perform a humiliating ritual in a river he thought was inferior. His anger was the reaction of a structured ego defending itself against a grace that wouldn't follow his rules. The miracle was there, but it was packaged in a way that made him feel like it was too good for him. He could only heal after he let go of his ideas, which was a mental death that came before his physical restoration. His servant's gentle logic, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, broke through his pride and showed him that the problem wasn't the method, but the way he thought. The widow who is facing debt slavery, on the other hand, is desperate to participate. Her mind was not one of proud hope, but of open vulnerability. With no other choice, she stood up and obeyed step by step. Elisha told her to get empty jars from her neighbors, which meant she had to publicly act in faith, show her need, and go through a process that seemed silly. Her miracle happened right in the middle of pouring. As she did what she was told, the divine power made the oil more. This was a beautiful example of how heavenly provision and human cooperation can work together. She had an active trust psychology, which meant that faith was not just a mental agreement, but also a physical action that involved taking risks. The Shunammite woman's unwavering hope reflects a distinct posture. She didn't just sit around and cry when her promised son died. She was fiercely determined to hold God to his word. Her journey to Elisha and her angry words, "Did I ask for a son from my Lord? Did I not say, 'Do not deceive me?' were not disrespectful, but a strong form of covenant faithfulness. She wouldn't believe that the God who gave the gift couldn't or wouldn't give it back. Her mind was full of stubborn hope, a will that held on to the promise of God even when all of her senses told her otherwise. Elisha's own hard work was possible because of her faith. Finally, the story shows how people were skeptical of each other during the siege of Samaria. The captain of the king's army exemplified this attitude by responding to Elisha's prophecy of abundance with cynical disbelief. If the Lord himself should make windows in heaven, could this thing be? His mindset was limited by natural law and the current situation, making it impossible for him to imagine a world where God could quickly end a famine. His doubt didn't stop the miracle from happening. It still happened, but it kept him from being a part of it. He saw the fulfillment with his own eyes, but was trampled at the gate. He was a tragic figure who saw the provision, but died because he didn't believe it. These different answers show a deep truth. A miracle is not a single divine force that overrides human will. It is an invitation to work together. God's power is supreme, yet his approach frequently respects the dignity of human agency. He tells Naaman to be humble instead of proud, tells the widow to join in instead of being desperate, gives the Shunammite a way to keep going instead of giving up, and gives the captain a consequence that shows how much it costs to not believe. So the recipient's psychology becomes a very important part of the miracle equation. The inner chamber is where the divine command is either accepted with trusting obedience or turned down because of pride, fear, or a sense of independence. Ultimately, the narratives of Elisha indicate that the heart most receptive to a miracle is not inherently the most virtuous, but rather the most receptive a heart, prepared to relinquish its preconceived notions of divine action and eager to engage in the extraordinary and marvelous narrative of his grace. Elisha's story often talks about the power that flowed through him, but there is also the rich, complicated emotional world of the man himself between the lines of miracles and prophecies. He was not an impersonal channel for divine power. Rather, he was a deeply emotional being, a prophet whose heart constituted both his greatest vulnerability and the essential attribute that rendered him a vessel of God's compassionate ministry. His emotional landscape shows that real spiritual authority doesn't get rid of human feelings. Instead, it makes them holy by directing passion through the lens of divine purpose. We see this most clearly in the way he cared so much that he acted. This was not a sentimental feeling. It was a strong connection to human suffering that called for action. When the widow cried out to him about her sons being sold into slavery, Elisha didn't just comfort her. He worked out a plan to free her step by step. His kindness was useful. Elisha didn't just say from a distance that the Shunammite woman's son would come back to life. He did a physically and spiritually hard thing to identify himself by lying on top of the child's body, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, and hands to hands until life came back. This was compassion as a costly physical investment. Even though the lost axe head seemed like a small problem, his first reaction, "Where did it fall?" showed that he was paying close attention to the exact personal point of a person's distress. His heart was like a compass needle that always pointed to need. But this same ability to feel deeply could turn into righteous anger when someone shows disrespect for the sacred. People often think that the incident with the Bethel youths who yelled, "Go up, you bald head," was a prophet's petty revenge. But the insult was very religious. "Go up" was a sarcastic reference to Elijah's rise to heaven, a cynical rejection of the prophetic office and the God it stood for. Bethel was a place where people worshipped an idolized calf, and this group of people was a new generation being taught to disrespect Yahweh's authority. Elisha's curse and the 2 bears that attacked him after that were not personal revenge, but a serious, legal act. It was a defense of God's holiness in a culture where blasphemy was common, a harsh lesson that making fun of the Lord's chosen one has serious consequences. His anger was the opposite of his compassion. It was a fiery commitment to God's honor that was the same as his fiery commitment to restoring people. Elisha's paternal grief may have been the most touching part of his emotional world. The tragedy of Gehazi makes this painfully clear. Gehazi wasn't just a servant. He was Elisha's apprentice, the one who carried his staff, and the one who was thought to be his spiritual heir. So the betrayal was more than just a professional letdown. It was a deep personal wound. When Elisha asked him, "Is it a time to receive money and clothes?" the words came from a father who was heartbroken. He had witnessed Naaman's real conversion, a moment of pure, unmerited grace, and then watched as his own student ruined it for a few pieces of silver and fine cloth. It was a legal act to give Naaman's leprosy to Gehazi, but it was also the moment Elisha realized that his hope for a successor was leprosy-ridden. The man who could bring the dead back to life could not bring the heart of his closest disciple back to life. A steady thread of prophetic patience ran through these stronger passions. Elisha's ministry lasted for 55 years, which took a lot of strength. He always found a way to get between God's promise and people's failure. He patiently helped Naaman get over his pride and stubbornness. He put up with King's doubts and Joash's weak faith, which only made him hit the ground 3 times. He worked in a country for decades where most people still worshipped idols, even after he performed miracles. This was not the patience of someone who didn't care, but the steadfastness of someone who knew that God's work is often a long obedience in the same direction, a slow, steady flow of grace on the hard stone of human hearts. Elisha's emotional life ultimately sanctifies the entirety of human emotion for those who serve God. His story tells us that our anger, compassion, sadness, and patience are not things that keep us from being spiritual. They are the things God uses to make us spiritual. His power didn't go around Elisha's humanity. It went through it. The prophet who cried for Gehazi was the same one who called bears and prayed for a dead child. He was also the same one who calmly cleaned up a poisoned stew. Elisha shows us that a heart that is fully alive to God is also fully alive to the world, including its pain, injustice, betrayals, and long, hard path to redemption. His emotional landscape remains a map for anyone who wants to serve God not as cold tools, but as living, feeling, and fully human partners in the work of grace. The Jordan River is where Elisha's life story comes to an end. Years earlier, after seeing Elijah rise to heaven, he had made a bold request while standing on the banks of that same river. "Please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." This was not just a request for more power. It was a request for the right of the firstborn son to inherit his master's work and continue it. The sign given was that he must see Elijah taken from him. He took up the mantle and parted the waters. The trip began, but the final proof that the request was fulfilled is not found in one moment, but in the whole tapestry of his long ministry, which shows a fulfillment that was both quantitative and deeply qualitative. A superficial reading frequently emphasizes the enumeration of miracles. According to one old way of counting, Elisha did exactly twice as many recorded miracles as Elijah 16 to Elijah's 8. This symmetry in numbers is interesting. Elijah called fire from heaven once, and Elisha called fire twice. Elijah made one widow's oil last longer, and Elisha made another's last longer, and fed 100 men with 20 loaves. Elijah brought one person back to life, but Elisha brought two back to life: the Shunammite's son and the man who touched his bones. This doubling in numbers is a clear structural proof of the request. The external evidence, the ledger of power, shows that he is the rightful heir who did greater works than his master in terms of output. But if you only think of the double portion as math, you miss its deeper spiritual meaning. The qualitative distinction in their ministries elucidates the essence of the double portion. Elijah's ministry was mostly about judging and confronting people. He was the prophet who foretold the drought, the prophet who stood up to Baal's priests on Carmel, and the voice that told kings about God's anger. His ministry had to tear down the altars of false gods. Even though Elisha lived in a sinful kingdom, his ministry was mostly about helping others and building things. He healed the sick, made more of what he had, brought people back to life, and fed the hungry. He built a school for the prophets and made sure the community had what it needed. Elijah's spirit was like a fire that burned away impurities, while Elisha's double portion of that same spirit was like a force that built things up and gave life. He got the same power, but it was used in a different, more caring way. The double portion was not only more power, but it was also power used with twice as much mercy. The extent of their impact further demonstrates this qualitative shift. Elijah's ministry was mostly about Israel, a nation that had made a deal with God. Elisha's compassion, on the other hand, went beyond religious and national lines. He healed Naaman, who was in charge of the Syrian army, which was Israel's enemy. He made sure that the blind Syrian army could get through safely and get what they needed. His ministry had a global, kind aspect that showed that God cared for more than just the people in the covenant community. This was a doubling of the scope, a widening of the circle of God's compassion that showed the heart of a God whose mercy extends to all of his creation. Lastly, the double portion is confirmed by the fact that it has lasted. Elijah's leaving was dramatic and final. Elisha's impact, on the other hand, lasted long after he died. The miracle that happened after the man's death, he came back to life when his bones touched him, is the best proof of how long the anointing he carried lasted. The power did not leave him when he died. It stayed with him, a holy residue on his body. His legacy was not only the miracles he did, but also the life that continued to flow from him, even after he died. This was something his master never experienced, a continuation of power that really doubled the effect of his ministry on earth, so the double portion was completely fulfilled. In terms of the number of wonders, qualitatively in the empathetic exercise of authority, geographically, in the broadening of its reach, and in time in the lasting nature of its legacy, Elisha got exactly what he wanted, the firstborn's inheritance. He didn't turn into Elijah. Instead, he became a more complete version of what Elijah's spirit could do when it was in the hands of a man whose whole life was a testimony to a God who doesn't just fight his enemies, but also builds, cares for, and brings his people back to life. The mantle that fell at the Jordan was not just picked up. It was worn in a way that doubled its reach and deepened its grace, fulfilling the prophetic succession in a way that went far beyond a simple list of miracles. Elisha's ministry is a long-term act of divine intervention that affects not only individual lives but also the very structures of social injustice. In a kingdom characterized by political corruption, economic inequality, and the subjugation of the vulnerable, his miracles served as deliberate manifestations of theological social work. They showed a God whose love was not just a personal feeling, but a public force that worked to break down systems of power and privilege, to give back to those on the edges their dignity and freedom. Elisha is not only a miracle worker, he is also a social reformer who used his prophetic authority to bring about justice. His economic interventions for the vulnerable show this best. The widow's situation in 2 Kings 4 is a classic case of systemic economic injustice. The debt system of the time, while legal, was designed to exploit the poor. and the loss of her husband had rendered her and her sons expendable. Elisha's miracle of the multiplying oil did more than just give her money. It changed her whole economic situation. He put her back into the economy by making a lot of valuable oil that she could sell. She was no longer a victim, but a participant with capital. This was a divine way of redistributing wealth, and it brought her back from the edge of ruin to a place where she could support herself. The recovery of the lost axe head, while it may seem small, kept a common worker from getting into a debt that could have ruined him. In an economy where tools were worth a lot of money, losing them could have started a downward spiral into indentured servitude. God's concern for this minor crisis indicated that his justice encompasses the ordinary economic challenges that afflict the working poor. Elisha's ministry also showed that he was always interested in the status of women in a society run by men. The Shunammite woman was financially stable, but she was socially vulnerable because she couldn't have children. In that culture, a woman's identity and safety were closely tied to her ability to have sons. So Elisha's promise and the gift of a son were both acts of social restoration that gave her honor and made sure she would have a good future in her community. Elisha's deep personal involvement in her son's resurrection after he died showed her worth and God's close concern for her as a mother. The widow who was about to lose her sons was also losing everything that held her life together, socially and financially. Elisha's intervention saved not only two people, but also a household, a family line, and a woman's place in the world. Elisha became God's megaphone in a society where women's voices were often silenced. He spoke out for them and made their problems known. This justice ministry went beyond national and ethnic lines, which went against Israel's narrow tribalism. The healing of Naaman, the leader of the Syrian army, was a very brave act of kindness across borders. Syria was not a friend. It was a dangerous, oppressive power. But God's mercy flowed through Elisha to heal the leader of the army. This miracle showed that God cared about justice and wholeness for more than just one nation or group of people. It went against nationalistic bias and showed a God whose love was as big as all of humanity. Elisha's plan for the military fight against the Syrian army was not to kill them all, but to confuse them with grace. He led the blinded soldiers into the heart of Samaria, fed them, and then sent them home in peace. This was a kind of restorative justice, not retributive justice, that tried to stop the cycle of violence. Lastly, Elisha's miracles always put the health of the community above his own power. The first miracle he did on his own was to heal the water supply in Jericho. This was not a private sign. It was a public utility restoration that helped the whole community deal with a health and economic crisis. The purification of the poisoned stew for the sons of the prophets and the multiplication of bread during a famine were both ways for the community to help each other. They are very different from Gehazi's greedy, selfish actions in which he tried to take away the blessing that was meant for Naaman. Elisha's ministry model condemns such individualism, showing that God's power is most fully shown when it works for the good of everyone. Elisha shows us that the God of the Bible cares about the systems that take away people's dignity. The miracles were God's way of commenting on a broken world. Each one was a statement against a certain kind of injustice, like exploitative debt, women's vulnerability, xenophobic nationalism, or community neglect. Elisha's prophetic authority was profoundly political, not by aligning with royal power, but by challenging the powers both seen and unseen that dehumanized God's creation. His life demonstrates that authentic spirituality is inherently connected to social justice, and that faith devoid of a tangible, transformative commitment to the marginalized is a mere reflection of the God who hears the cries of the oppressed and dispatches his prophets to respond. Elisha's power was very different from that of any other power structure in his time. Kings ruled by blood and the strength of their armies, while priests ruled by tradition and ritual. But Elisha's power came from a completely different place, a direct connection to the divine will. His authority was not institutional or delegated. It was organic and spiritual, and it came from his faithfulness to God's word. This is an important difference. He did not speak for God like a royal ambassador would speak for a king. Instead, he spoke the word of the Lord as someone who was in the divine council and heard its orders. His authority was not based on his position, but on the quality of his attention and the courage of his obedience. Because of this relational base, his authority often showed up in strange ways. It could be very close, like when he lay on top of a dead child and prayed with his body to bring him back to life. But it could also have cosmic power, like making iron float or blinding an army. It could be patient with a widow who was unsure, but it could also curse mocking teens very harshly. This paradox shows that real prophetic authority is not a single, unchanging force, but something that can change. It adjusts itself to the situation at hand, whether that situation is the fragile state of a grieving mother or the rebellious blasphemy of a corrupt culture. It serves as both a surgeon's scalpel and a warrior's sword, its use dictated by the specific spiritual condition it confronts. Elisha's authority was unique because it didn't depend on political power. He wasn't a court prophet who needed the king's favor to stay alive or safe. The royal treasury did not pay for his ministry. Instead, it was paid for by the generosity of a Shunammite woman and the resources of the prophetic communities. Because he was independent, he could tell kings things they didn't want to hear without backing down. He could tell a desperate king that God would help him while also condemning his cynical captain. He could tell a king to shoot arrows of victory and then tell him he wasn't really believing. His authority was not confirmed by royal approval. Rather, it judged it, reminding political leaders that they too were under a higher power. His authority was also supported by its moral consistency and compassionate goals. Elisha never did miracles to make himself look good or to show off. They had clear and kind goals: freedom for the poor, healing for the sick, food for the hungry, and justice for the poor. This is the opposite of Gehazi's greed, which made him want to use his closeness to power for his own gain. Gehazi's leprosy is a sign from God that trying to make money off of or corrupt the prophetic office is wrong. Elisha is a true authority because he serves God's loving nature without expecting anything in return. The power is real because it comes from love. Lastly, Elisha's life shows that having true prophetic authority comes with a heavy personal price. He lived a life full of spiritual and emotional pain. He had to deal with Naaman's pride, the Shunammite's grief, the king's desperation, and the horrible betrayal of his own servant. The man who could call down fire from the sky or bring bears from the woods was also the man whose heart broke when Gehazi failed. This vulnerability is not a flaw. It is the mark of real authority, a power that stays fully human and feels the weight of the ministry it carries. It is a cost that the prophet pays alone, in the secret places of prayer and pain, where he stands between a holy God and a broken people. We see in Elisha that prophetic authority isn't about having power over others, but about getting them to agree with you. It is a humble, brave, and expensive task to align one's life, words, and actions so completely with the heart and will of God that divine power flows through without any problems. It is an authority that serves, weeps, confronts, and heals. Its ultimate source is love, and its ultimate goal is restoration. Elisha's ministry does not end with his burial. Its effects can still be felt today, and they are strongest in the person and work of Jesus Christ. The New Testament depicts Jesus not merely as a successor to the prophets in a linear fashion, but as the realization and embodiment of the prophetic paradigm they established. In this divine tapestry, Elisha's life and miracles are woven directly into the Gospels, showing how God's ways of saving people have always been the same. Jesus makes this connection clear in the synagogue in Nazareth. At the beginning of his public ministry, Jesus purposefully brings up the stories of Elijah and Elisha to remind his listeners that there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, and Elijah was sent to none of them but only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. There were many lepers in Israel during the time of the prophet Elisha, but only Naaman the Syrian was healed. Luke 4:25-27. In this bold statement, Jesus compares his own ministry to the prophet's compassion that breaks down barriers and causes trouble. He says that his mission, like theirs, will go beyond ethnic and national boundaries, bringing God's grace to those who are not part of the religious establishment and questioning their narrow-minded beliefs. The crowd's angry reaction shows that they understood the radical meaning. Jesus was saying that he was the fulfillment of this prophetic tradition, and that his grace, like Elisha's, would be given freely beyond what they expected. Aside from this direct reference, the miracles of Jesus often seem to be thematic intensifications of Elisha's works. Elisha made 20 loaves into enough food for 100 men, and Jesus made 5 loaves into enough food for 5,000 men, women, and children, with 12 baskets left over. Elisha healed Naaman's leprosy by telling him to wash. Jesus healed lepers with a word or a touch, showing that he had even more power. Elisha brought the Shunammite's son back to life by praying hard and physically touching him. Jesus brought Jairus' daughter and the widow of Nain's son back to life with a simple command. The pattern is one of growth. The power that worked through Elisha is now in Jesus. He is not just a prophet who does miracles. He is the Lord of the miracles themselves. Moreover, the typological connections are significant. Elisha's first miracle was to heal the waters of Jericho with salt, which made a deadly source clean. Jesus' ministry begins a new covenant. He doesn't just offer clean water. He offers living water that becomes a spring of eternal life inside a person. John 4:14. Elisha's healing of Naaman, who dipped 7 times in the Jordan, is like Christian baptism in that it cleanses not physical leprosy, but the spiritual leprosy of sin through the waters of death and resurrection with Christ. The most striking thing is that the dead man who came back to life when he touched Elisha's bones is a sign of the power that comes from Christ's crucified and resurrected body. Life flowed from Elisha's dead body, and eternal life flows to everyone who has faith in Jesus' death and resurrection. In the New Testament, Elisha stands out as an important prophet whose life was a prophecy of the Messiah to come. His ministry of compassionate power, which included Gentiles and outcasts, was a sign of the gospel's universal reach. His miracles were great, but they were only shadows of the greater things Christ would do. Jesus himself said, "There has been no one greater than John the Baptist among those born of women. But the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than him." Matthew 11:11. This rule also applies to Elisha. His ministry was great, but it was also a sign of something bigger. The kingdom of God breaking into the world through Jesus Christ, the ultimate prophet, priest, and king, in whom all the shadows of the old covenant find their substance and their end. The story of Elisha is not an old artifact to be admired. It is a plan to be lived out. The prophet's compassionate power was not meant to stop with his bones. It was meant to spread through time and invite every generation to see and take part in the work of a God who still provides, heals, and restores. Today, finding Elisha isn't about looking for a copy of him. It's about understanding the spirit of his ministry, which is one of attentive compassion, subversive provision, and humble authority, and then living it out in the unique challenges and opportunities of our own time. The first step in this embodiment is to develop prophetic perception. Elisha saw things that other people couldn't see before he did any miracles. He saw the holy in the everyday Shunammite woman, the healing power in a proud Syrian general, and the heavenly army that was protecting a city that was under siege. In a world full of surface-level appearances and digital noise, the Elisha-like calling is to see things in a deeper, more theological way. To see God's image in the refugee, the addict, and the political enemy. It is to understand the spiritual need that drives a culture's consumerism and the need for justice that comes from a broken system. This is not a mystical retreat from the world. Rather, it is a profound engagement with it, perceiving every individual and situation through the perspective of God's redemptive potential. The first miracle is often when we get our sight back. From this new way of seeing things comes a promise to be practically and actively compassionate. Elisha's miracles almost never happened on their own. They made the widow collect jars, Naaman dip in the river, and the king shoot arrows. God's power was set in motion by people working together. The Elisha principle tells us to work together with God's grace today. We are asked to be the ones who collect the empty jars for people who are having money problems. We can do this by teaching people about money, starting microloan programs, or pushing for fair economic policies. We are called to lead the Naamans of our time, the proud and powerful, toward the humbling waters of grace through honest conversation and brave truth-telling. In our time, the multiplication of loaves might mean community gardens, networks for recovering food, or just inviting a lonely neighbor to share our table. God still uses the simple, obedient actions of faithful people as the basis for His amazing gifts. In addition, Elisha's legacy pushes us to use a subversive authority that comes from serving others. Elisha's idea of power is very different from what most people think of today, when they are obsessed with platforms, influence, and fame. He didn't have power because of a title or a following. He had power because he was close to God and wanted to help others thrive. The modern Elisha is the quiet leader of a non-profit, the teacher in a school that doesn't have enough resources, the nurse in a busy ward, or the parent who is taking care of a troubled child. Their power doesn't come from their job. It comes from the faithful service they do, which is often not seen. They don't fight the powers with worldly weapons. Instead, they use the tools of the kingdom: love, truth, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief in the worth of every person. Like Elisha standing up to the king, they speak truth to power. However, their main goal is not to fight, but to engage in costly, constructive ways for the good of everyone. Elisha's story ultimately encourages us to have faith in the lasting power of a faithful legacy. The prophet's influence continued long after he died, as shown by the amazing image of a corpse coming back to life when it touched his bones. This is a strong metaphor for how a life fully given to God can still have an effect. The prayers we say, the good things we do, and the justice we seek are not just temporary things. They are seeds planted in God's eternal plans, and we may never see the full harvest. A kind word said today could bring a soul back to life decades from now. A stand for what is right may give strength to generations that have not yet been born. We are not supposed to plan our own legacy. Instead, we are supposed to be so full of Christ's presence and love that His life continues to flow through the things we do long after we are gone. So, in the end, finding Elisha today is about realizing that the same Spirit that gave the prophet strength is still at work in the world, calling and equipping people to be agents of divine compassion. It is a call to see the world through God's eyes, to give our hands to Him to use our authority through service, and to live with the quiet confidence that our faithful participation in His work, no matter how small it seems, has an eternal weight of glory. The mantle hasn't fallen for the last time. It's still there, waiting for each generation to pick it up. Elisha's story doesn't end in the tomb. It lives on in the voice of a God who is always loving. Throughout the years of His ministry, we have seen a power that was never abstract, but always personal, affecting the poisoned spring, the empty jar, the grieving mother, and the proud soldier. His legacy is not just a list of amazing things. It is also a permanent picture of the divine nature, a sovereignty that shows itself in mercy, a holiness that bends to heal, and a word that has the power to make what it commands. He leaves us with an invitation to put our faith not in the absence of problems, but in the presence of a provider who takes care of both national and everyday problems. In a world still broken by fear, injustice, and hopelessness, the way of the loving prophet is still open. It is the way of seeing things through God's eyes, of giving our everyday resources to Him for His amazing use, and of believing that the same power that made iron swim and bones give life is still at work, changing our fear into faith and our despair into a testimony of God's provision. The God of Elisha still speaks the language of miracles, and His grammar is still grace. If you want more stories that wrestle with mercy, with justice, and with the messy, beautiful complexities of faith, then go ahead and subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell. It's absolutely free, and it helps these narratives keep sailing to new shores, reaching more people who need to hear them. And here's another question for the comments. Who is the Nineveh person or group in your life, the one you struggle to wish well? Let's practice surrender and radical compassion together.